Chapter 35:12. Yijinggang looked at his wife and frowned. What is it? Su Fu slowly walked to the dining table and gave him a rare smile. Sit down and eat. Yijinggang walked over, thinking that it was because he went to Xia Anning's place last night, so Su Fu probably cared. He sat down, cleared his throat, and said with great emotion, Su Fu, I admit that I let you down, but I'm also very uncomfortable with what happened to you. Let's forget about the unhappy past and start anew. Su Fu looked at him, and after a long time, he poured himself a cup of milk and said softly, You might have misunderstood. Yijinggang still insisted, Aren't you still brooding over what happened last night and want to mend our relationship? Su Fu gently shook his head. No, I just want to tell you that I'll move out. This way, it'll be more convenient for you. Yijinggang suddenly jumped up in rage. Su Fu, you're the one who wants to make it convenient for yourself, aren't you? Last night, he had played down the matter, but now, he did not plan to let her go. He insisted on digging to the bottom. Tell me which pretty boy it is, I won't kill him. There's no pretty boy. I want to move out because of Xia Anning. Su Fu was also angered. Don't tell me I don't even have this bit of freedom. What right does a cheating husband have to point fingers at me? As she spoke, she stopped eating breakfast and went upstairs to pack her things. Yijinggang also followed, kicked open the bedroom door and locked it. Su Fu walked out of the changing room and looked at him. What do you want to do? Yijinggang stared at her and said very slowly, It's probably because we haven't been husband and wife for a long time, so you've forgotten our feelings. As he spoke, he walked towards her step by step. Su Fu was stunned, and her voice carried a hint of shock. Yijinggang, what are you trying to do? Are you crazy? She retreated until she was pressed against the side of the bed. Yijinggang pressed her shoulder, and his eyes seemed to be on fire. Look at you now. You're dressed so well because you found a gigolo, right? What kind of person is he? Do you also long for him to hug you? As he spoke, he cupped her body and kissed her neck. Su Fu was a little old, but she took good care of herself. Yijinggang hadn't touched her for a long time, so she got excited all of a sudden, even if it was a ridiculous night last night. He kissed her neck and moved up to kiss her lips. Su Fu pushed him away forcefully and slapped him. This slap stunned Yijinggang, and he stared at her blankly. Su Fu panted and said softly, Get lost. Yijinggang was enraged. Which gigolo is it that you're so interested in? I'll find out and kill him. He didn't force her anymore. He slammed the door and left. When he left the house, he heard a deathly silence coming from the house behind him. Yijinggang suddenly turned his head and looked behind him as if he was looking at a ferocious beast. He knew that it was the sound of his Su Fu's marriage shattering. Yijinggang returned to his office and asked the staff in the office. Xia Anning had already arrived. He heaved a sigh of relief. What he was most afraid of was a woman being irrational. He already had one at home, so he didn't want this one to be irrational. He was drunk last night, and Xia Anning took it seriously. It was really unreasonable. Chapter 35:13. Yijinggang dialed the number and poured out his grievances. Hao Yun, what do you think is wrong with this woman? With a pretty boy, I'm nothing. I can't even touch him, and he even slapped me in the face. He rambled on, saying a lot of things. In the end, Yijinggang concluded, Help me find out who this pretty boy is. I'll cripple him. Hao Yun felt a chill somewhere and coughed lightly. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe it's just love and nothing else. It's all fishes and geese coming back and forth. How can there be so many pure feelings in this world? Yijinggang was a little annoyed. Hao Yun, I can't tell the children about this. I can only trust and count on you. I can't let my identity catch the adulterer personally. It's not good for the public to know. As he spoke, he lit a cigarette. When you have time, try to persuade Su Fu. Aren't you her junior? I remember that you were in the same club as her in school. Hao Yun said softly, do you still remember? But Su Fu might not remember. She has a good memory. Yi Xingang complained and then said, what do you think about Xia Anning? Father Yi was feeling rather uncomfortable because he didn't seem to be able to get rid of her. He knew that if he wanted to return to Su Fu, he had to break off his relationship with Xia Anning, but how could it be that easy? Hao Yun was silent. You have to make the decision yourself. Talk to her. Yeah, let's take it slow. Yi Xingang sighed and said a lot more. At the door, Xia Anning opened the door a little and closed it again. Her heart was beating fast and her face was filled with unwillingness. Yi Xingang wanted to give up. After so many years, he said that he didn't want her and he didn't want her anymore. He was the one who promised her last night. How could she allow herself to be thrown away like this? She returned to the office and sat on the office chair to grab her hair. After a long time, she bit her lips. She could only fight with her life on the line. Xia Anning immediately made a call. His voice was very soft. Dean Wang, I would like to ask for your help. 3 days later. When Xia Ning came to the Yi family's mansion, it was working time. Su Fu was still unable to successfully move out, because Yi Xingang had used all sorts of methods. Hearing that Xia Ning had come to visit, Su Fu was surprised, but he still invited him in. Xia Anning and Su Fu were very familiar with each other in the past. Because of work, Xia Anning would come over from time to time, and Su Fu would always treat her to the handmade biscuits he made. Only when he saw Xia Ning hugging Yi Xingang in the house did Su Fu understand that this secretary's true identity was to warm his husband's bed. If they were to meet again now, it would naturally not be pleasant. Su Fu was wearing a light beige robe. Her hair was braided and looked very comfortable at home. Her entire body exuded a comfortable aura of a lady from a wealthy family. When Xia Ning saw Su Fu, he felt a little inferior. Some people were like this, they did not need to do anything and were born with a halo. Su Fu was such a person. Do you have something important to discuss with me? Su Fu asked politely as he held a cup of tea in his hand. Xia Ning gently licked his lower lip and said with some difficulty, it's like this, I'm pregnant. As he spoke, he placed a pregnancy test form in front of Su Fu. Su Fu looked at the piece of paper quietly and did not pick it up to read. Xia Ning's voice was very soft. It's been more than a month. I want to give birth to the child. Chapter 35:14. She was actually a little surprised. After she gave birth to Mu Bai, Yi Xingang had already undergone a vasectomy. At his age, it was impossible for him to want a child, let alone a child born from another concubine. He cherished his feathers so much, how could he have done such a thing? Therefore, Xia Ning's stomach was either empty or pregnant with someone else's seed. However, Su Fu did not expose her. What was there to expose? Just let her and Yi Xingang bite each other. Su Fu asked softly, what do you want? Xia Ning's voice was a little tight. He promised to marry me. But I know he still has feelings for you. Su Fu looked at her, you mean you want me to take the initiative to withdraw and divorce Yi Xingang so that your child can have a name? Xia Ning's face was haggard. Teacher Su, I really let you down, but I know you're kind. You won't be willing to see a child disappear just like that, and the child is just right. Don't you love him very much? Su Fu signaled for her to stop and smiled faintly. You've already given birth to a child with him. How can I love him? Xia Ning's expression was uneasy. She then knelt in front of Su Fu and choked with sobs. I'm begging you. This is my first time being a mother, and it might be my only chance in my life. Su Fu looked at her and did not call her up. He only said seriously, are you sure you want to get married because of your child? Have you thought about what the public will say? A mouthful of saliva from each person will drown you. As long as you help me, you can say that there are no feelings. Me and him. We can hide our marriage. Xia Ning's eyes were filled with tears. Su Fu looked at the woman in front of him who he had watched grow up. She was only a few years older than Mu Lin, but she had climbed into Mu Lin's father's bed and even cried to say that she had a child. Didn't she feel that life was ridiculous? Su Fu was silent for a long time. Xia Ning kept looking at her with a pitiful expression. Su Fu finally opened his mouth, but his voice was a little heavy. Even if I have to kneel down, I have to finish the path I chose. Xia Anning said with tears in his eyes, thank you. After she left, Su Fu hung up the phone and called Yi Xinggang. Come back when you have time. Yi Xinggang's heart skipped a beat, but he still returned to the old house in advance. Su Fu sat in the small parlor, still looking like a pale chrysanthemum. Yi Xinggang sat opposite her, his eyes unable to move away. When he was old, he might have remembered his wife's kindness, and the women outside were always a little hysterical. Su Fu's voice was indifferent. Xia Ning has been here, let me see this. As she spoke, she showed him the hospital certificate. Yi Xinggang reached out and took a look. Then, his expression changed drastically. Pregnancy proof. His complexion was very bad. He put it down heavily and looked at his wife. It's impossible to have this child. But I've confirmed it again and again. She said it's your child and wants me to divorce you. Su Fu paused for a moment, then slowly said, I'm willing, it's up to you. Yi Xinggang was instantly flustered and exasperated. Su Fu, are you just trying to find an excuse to divorce me? Don't even think about it. He took the certificate and hurriedly got up. When he got up, he felt dizzy. He was so angry. He did not leave and went to Xia Ning's residence. The car stopped and he went upstairs. Xia Ning was half lying on the bed, looking very fragile. When she saw him come in, she said softly, you know everything. Chapter 35:15. Xia Anning immediately sat up on the bed. How is that possible? She muttered, if that's the case, why didn't Su Fu say it? Yi Xinggang's face was extremely cold. Tell me, why didn't you say it? At this moment, he was flustered and exasperated. After speaking to Xia Anning, he was about to leave, but Xia Anning immediately got off the bed and pulled him back, hugging him from behind, and muttered, Xinggang, I was wrong, I shouldn't have lied to you. I'm not pregnant, I don't have any other man, it's Su Fu who has ill intentions, she clearly knows that you have a ligation, right? She dug a pit for me to jump into, Xinggang, I'm innocent. Stop your acting. Yi Xinggang reached out and pushed her away. Seeing her fall onto the bed, he said coldly, Xia Anning, you said before that you don't want a title, but now look at your own face. My face. Xia Ning laughed with tears streaming down her face. She took a pillow and threw it over. Yi Xinggang, which woman has slept with a man for more than 10 years without a reason? Which woman doesn't want to get married and have children? Which woman is willing to be a shameful mistress? She shook her head. I begged her, I knelt down and begged her. She clearly knew that I didn't have a child, but she still agreed. Yi Xinggang, do you know why? Because she doesn't love you anymore. She wants to get rid of you. In this world, only I love you the most, and only I care about you. Her face was covered in tears, but Yi Xinggang was unmoved. you must be crazy. He turned around and left. Xia Anning cried uncontrollably behind him. That night, Xia Anning committed suicide. In order to appease her, in order to not cause a scandal, Yi Zhengang gave in. He did not separate from her, but he did not promise to marry her either. And the concession he made to Su Fu was to let her move out of the Yi family's mansion and live in Qin Garden. Half a month later, Hao Yun appeared in Qin Garden. Su Fu was making snacks, and because the temperature of the oven was high, she was only wearing a loose floral dress. Hao Yun stood at the door and watched until she noticed him. After staring at each other for a long time, Hao Yun smiled and took out a bag of food. I brought this from H City. Try it. Su Fu straightened up and walked over to take it. I thought you were going to give me books again. Hao Yun smiled faintly. That can't be eaten. He sat down and watched as she brewed a pot of flower tea to go with the snacks he had brought. Neither of them spoke. They just sat quietly, tasting her tea and his snacks. It had been a long time since she felt so peaceful. Finally, he asked, "Are you all right?" Su Fu said in a low voice, "Pretty good. You know about Xia Anning, don't you?" Hao Yun said something fair. "Xia Anning is temporary. Elder Yi will definitely take her away. It's just a matter of time." Su Fu smiled faintly. "Are you going to be the lobbyist?" Hao Yun's gaze fell on her face. He was a little straight, and his Adam's apple moved slightly. "What do you want me to do?" Su Fu poured him a cup of tea, and said indifferently, "I just hope that you will come, just to drink a cup of tea and eat something with me." Hao Yun swallowed all his words and nodded, "Yes, that's all." Su Fu looked at him. He wanted to say a lot, but in the end, he did not say anything. Hao Yun said, "Wait for Mu Lin to grow up." Chapter 35:16. Su Fu looked at Hao Yun and said calmly, "Is Mulin back too?" Hao Yun shook his head. "No, I came back alone. I have to rush back to City H." Su Fu looked at him in surprise. Hao Yun finished his cup of tea and smiled. "I'm relieved to see that you're doing well. Su Fu, you deserve to be courted and treated well. So, don't say that it was too hard for him to travel thousands of miles just to drink a cup of tea. She deserved his courtship." Hao Yun left and Su Fu sat there for the whole night. His gaze was fixed on the cup of tea that Hao Yun had just drunk. The next time he came back was a week later. He came back with Yi Mulin to meet Su Fu. In front of Yi Mulin, Hao Yun naturally restrained himself. It was the same for Su Fu. He actually said it out, but he didn't cross the line. Su Fu didn't accept it. He always appeared by her side politely and didn't cause her any trouble. Yi Mulin and Su Fu had dinner and said that they were going to leave. Hao Yun left with him. But when they were in the car, he thought of something. "I forgot my briefcase. I'll go get it." Yi Mulin looked at his back view and was deep in thought. Hao Yun returned to the living room. Su Fu was still sitting there. He went over to pick up the briefcase and coughed. "I'm leaving." She looked up and nodded. Hao Yun took out a small box from the briefcase. Something small. After he left, Su Fu opened it. It was a specimen. The leaves of the French plane tree that was unique to City H were pressed neatly. There was a golden glow on it. She seemed to be able to smell the autumn scent of City H. Su Fu chuckled and turned the specimen into a bookmark. Later on, when he was reading, he would place it in his book. On the other side, Hao Yun got into the car. Yi Mulin personally drove. "Uncle Hao, are you going to my father's place?" Hao Yun paused for a moment. "Tomorrow then." Yi Mulin left the courtyard and turned the steering wheel. "I'll take you home." Hao Yun nodded. He was also a very sensitive person, so he wasn't sure if Mu Lin knew anything. Yi Mulin sent Hao Yun home and went straight to Bai Shuali's small apartment. When he arrived, it was already 10:00 at night. The lights in her apartment were still dark. His car was parked downstairs. He sat in the car and took out his phone. He hesitated for a moment and decided not to call her. He sat in the car and waited quietly. Bai Shuali came back at midnight. When she got out of the taxi, she was stunned when she saw his car. She walked over slowly. Yi Mulin sat in the car and looked at her black stockings, short skirt, and a short white coat. She was very beautiful, but not expensive clothes. He opened the car door, got out, and quietly walked to her. She seemed to be a little dazed, as if she hadn't expected him to appear here. After a while, she suddenly laughed sharply. Yi Mulin, do you really think that my place is your Shao Hun's nest in City B? Without waiting for him to reply, she carried her small handbag and walked briskly towards the old stairs. When she passed by him, he smelled a cheap perfume. He grabbed her wrist abruptly. You're working there again. Bai Shuali turned her head and stared at him. Yes, what's wrong? His gaze was deep. Bai Shuali smiled gently. Are you saying that if you give me 300,000 yuan, I should wait for you in City B? Chapter 35:17. Bai Shuali looked at him. Your temper. Yi Mulin, don't tell me you still think I'll spoil your temper. She turned around and left, not even bothering to look at him. Yi Mulin followed her. When she opened the door, he pushed her in with one hand. The door was closed quickly and she was kissed by him. There was a faint taste of tobacco in his mouth. It was the unique smell of a mature man. She used to be so addicted to him, but she didn't dare to be moved by him in front of her. After the kiss, she didn't push him away. Instead, she tilted her head and looked at him. I need money. Yi Mulin, if you want to keep me, 2 million a month. He stared at her with an unfathomable gaze. She looked at him provocatively. After a long time, he whispered, then don't work there. She brushed her hair and said indifferently, of course, no one likes to be hugged. Yi Mulin let go of her, took out his checkbook and wrote a check for 2 million. Bai Shuali took it and looked down. Thank you, Mr. Yi. She was like a woman who had just had a good time. After putting away the check, she undressed him gently. Yi Mulin pressed her hand down. His eyes seemed to be on fire. He carried her up and walked to her bed. He pressed her down and murmured, let's go somewhere else. This place is like a doghouse because of you. They couldn't even find a place to make love. Bai Shuali didn't object. She pulled his neck down and kissed him. Yi Mulin poured out all the desire that he had accumulated for a month. It was probably because he was in too much of a hurry that he didn't have time to take precautions. After they were done, she suddenly got up and whispered, I'm going out for a while. Yi Mulin sat up. It's almost dawn. Where are you going? To buy medicine, she whispered and then looked at him. I can't get pregnant, can I? It wasn't just that she didn't want to get pregnant. If she couldn't get pregnant, how could the Bai and Yi families have children? It was just like the child that she had lost. If the child hadn't, it would have been difficult for many people. At that time, would he have let her give birth to the child? Bai Shuali realized that she didn't dare to ask such a question. She was afraid that he would say such a cruel answer. Too cruel to the child, too cruel to herself. Yi Mulin looked at her and was silent for a while. He whispered, I'll buy it for you tomorrow morning. She didn't persist any longer and slowly lay down. He hugged her from behind. After a long time, he asked in a low voice, Shirley, do you hate me? She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she asked him, "Did you give me money because you sympathize with me or because you just want to sleep with me?" The person behind her froze. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "Go to sleep first." The next morning, he bought her medicine and breakfast. When he returned to the small apartment, he walked quietly. Baishuali was still asleep, exhausted. Last night, he was a little rough. He did it a few times, but he was not gentle at all. She probably could not walk well today. Thinking of this, he sat on the bed and put down the breakfast and medicine. He said softly, "I have something to deal with, so I can only come over in the afternoon. In the afternoon, I'll take you to your new place to have a look, okay?" Chapter 35:18. The strap of her pajamas slid down, revealing half of her delicate shoulder. There were red marks on it from last night. Yi Mulin looked at it quietly, his fingers caressing it with a restrained look on his face. He could give her money and he could sleep with her, but he couldn't promise her anything, at least not now. He left and settled his business. When he returned to her apartment, it was already 4 in the afternoon. When he opened the door, Baishuali was still lying on the bed. However, she had taken the medicine on the table and taken a few bites of her breakfast. He walked over to wake her up, but he didn't expect her to be awake. Her face was pale as though she was enduring a lot of pain. Yi Mulin said softly, "What's wrong?" She tilted her head and looked at him, smiling weakly. "Nothing, it's just an old problem." She sat up and thought for a moment before saying, "I've had menstrual pain since the abortion. I don't feel well after taking the medicine this time. Why didn't you call me?" His voice was stern. "You've been enduring it since the morning." Baishuali looked at him with a strange gaze. "What identity should I use to call you?" "Mr. Yi, I know what I am now." His face turned even darker, but he didn't say anything. He just went to get her jacket and hugged her tightly. He asked if she had a hot water bottle, and she said she did. He filled one for her and put it in her arms, then carried her downstairs. When he carried her down the stairs, her tears streamed down, but she didn't let him see them. She was afraid that she would be weak and fall in love with this feeling again. He placed her in the back seat and said softly, "Lie down if you're in pain. We'll be at the hospital soon." She nodded. But she didn't lie down. Instead, she leaned against the back seat and hugged the hot water bottle tightly as though it was her only source of warmth. When they arrived at the hospital, they found an experienced female doctor to take a look at her. The female doctor examined her, took an X-ray, and asked about her marriage and childbirth history. Baishuali whispered, "Divorced, had an abortion." The female doctor looked at Yi Mulin. She had a feeling that she had seen this young man somewhere before. She then looked at the scan in her hand and said in a low voice, "She didn't have a good rest after the abortion last time. Now it seems that the uterus is too thin. It will be difficult for her to conceive in the future. Also, don't take the morning after pill anymore. It's better for the man to take precautions." As the female doctor spoke, she prescribed some Chinese medicine to stop bleeding and warmed the meridians for her to take back. Yi Mulin concocted the medicine and carried her away. When they returned, he sat her down beside him and handed her a cup of hot milk tea. He said in a low voice, "I didn't take good care of you." Her face was still very pale. She lowered her head and took a sip of milk tea. It was warm and comfortable. She shook her head nonchalantly. "We're getting divorced. You have no obligation to take care of me." Yi Mulin's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. After a pause, he finally asked, "Do you hate me?" Baishuali smiled and didn't say anything. She just turned her face outside the window. After a long time, she said, "Hate or not, life has to go on." He suddenly felt extremely uncomfortable. When did his Bai Shuali become so negative? Suddenly, she said, Xiao Bai is dead. His fingers tightened. Bai Shuali raised her head. Look, I can't even protect Xiao Bai, let alone a child. Chapter 35:19. Yi Mulin tilted his head and looked at her. He pursed his lips and felt a deep sense of helplessness. This child was the pain between them that couldn't be mentioned. He said with difficulty, we will have children in the future. Bai Shuali's eyes turned red and she smiled lightly. Really? Yi Mulin, do you think so? Then she said with a choked voice, Yi Mulin, maybe you will have many children in the future, and I will have children too. But we won't have children anymore. The atmosphere froze. Bai Shuali looked at him. Don't you always ask me if I hate you? If you want to hear the truth, I can tell you that I hate you. Do you still want to be with me? Aren't you afraid that I will kill you one day? You won't. His voice was very low, and it carried a wisp of desolation. Bai Shuali said softly, Mr. Yi, I'm not interested in you or your power. I only like your money. He stared at her, leaning closer. That's how you convince yourself, isn't it? She lowers her eyes and smiles lightly. Maybe it is, if it can make Mr. Yi feel better. If they continued to talk, they would not be able to see eye to eye, and he would be too stupid to continue. Thus, he started the car and drove into a villa area. It was very high-end, and he heard that many celebrities lived here. Bai Shuali sat in the car and looked at the villa. She smiled lightly. Mr. Yi is so generous. She didn't refuse. She opened the door and dragged her weak body in. Yi Mulin went to help her. This place was much better than the shabby apartment she used to live in. She sat on the sofa. Yi Mulin squatted down and said softly, Can I carry you upstairs? She looked at him and said softly, I want to drink some brown sugar water. Is that okay? He stared at her, put his hand on her leg and patted it gently. I'll make it for you. After saying that, he got up and went to the kitchen. She looked at his back. Just like before, he was still tall and handsome. She didn't know if it was because of the official's aura, but his temperament seemed more stable. Apart from physical contact, she couldn't see through him, but she had never seen through him before. There were 2 servants in the house, but Yi Mulin still personally boiled the brown sugar water for her. He brought it over while it was still warm and helped her drink it slowly. After drinking, she handed the cup to him and said softly, I want to sleep for a while. At this time, the sky was already dark. The crystal lights in the hall were bright, illuminating the expressions on each other's faces. Bai Shuali didn't want to be seen by him, so she gently turned her face away. He carried her upstairs, put her on the bed in the master bedroom, and ruffled her hair. Take a nap. I'll get you a hot water bottle. When you wake up, take the medicine, and we'll have dinner together, okay? She did not object and gently closed her eyes. Yi Mulin's fingers gently rubbed her cheek. After a long time, he got up and went downstairs. As he walked down the stairs, his mind was a little heavy. With every step he took, he seemed to hear what she had said to him in the car. Yi Mulin, if you want to hear the truth, it's that I hate you. I can't even protect Xiao Bai, let alone a child. His heart suddenly tightened, and he felt a dull pain. Chapter 35:20. During this time, he received a phone call from his father. The content was very harsh, probably because of Shuali. Mulin, I heard that you arranged for Bai Shuali to live in the villa, right? Yi Xinggang was a little unhappy. A failed family should have less contact with them, not to mention raising them openly. Yi Mulin said indifferently, I'm just taking care of her. Gang was silent for a while. Your Uncle Wen's daughter is back. You've met her before. Her name is Wen Yuan, and she's a very good girl. Think about it, it's an exchange. As long as Wen Yuan doesn't mind, you can raise her if you want, but you can never marry her. Yi Mulin held the phone. What if I don't see Wen Yuan? Gang blew out a mouthful of smoke and said indifferently, then you should know that it's easy to add to the crime. Mu Lin, you saved the Bai family, but your feelings for Bai Shuali have also harmed them. You should know what to do. Yi Mulin was expressionless. I'll see Wen Yuan. Dad, you can't touch Shuali. If you do, you know what will happen to me. He hung up the phone. But as soon as he looked up, he saw Bai Shuali standing on the stairs, looking straight at him. Yi Mulin didn't know how much she had heard, so he put away the phone and said indifferently, "Why are you up?" He went over and helped her up the stairs. He helped her to lie on the bed and he leaned forward to cover her with the quilt. After settling down, he was about to straighten up when she suddenly put her arms around his neck. Yi Mulin's body stiffened. This was the first time she had been so close to him after their divorce. He held his breath. Shuali. His voice was a little shaky, and there was even a trace of humility. She looked at him and asked softly, "You're going on a blind date, aren't you?" He didn't answer immediately, but stared at her for a while before he pulled her hand away and straightened up. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and gave her a bleak view of his back. His voice was low and hoarse. "Bai Shuali, there are many things that I don't have a choice like you." He turned his head and stared at her. At that moment, she wasn't sure if his eyes were bloodshot. "If I were to go on a blind date, would you still follow me?" he asked slowly, enunciating each word. The air seemed to freeze. They used to be husband and wife, but he might soon belong to another woman, and she was a mistress that he could not see, a mistress, a vixen that he kept outside. Bai Shuali's nose was a little red. She hugged herself against the headboard. She smiled as if she didn't care. "It doesn't matter. As long as you give me money, I don't care about status." He looked at her, and Shirley gave him a bitchy smile. His hand trembled as he lit up a cigarette, but he didn't smoke it. He quickly walked over and leaned over to kiss her. Using his body advantage, he quickly covered her. His thin lips kissed her, and he even pinched her chin with one hand to deepen the kiss and prevent her from struggling. After the long kiss, both of them were breathing heavily, especially Bai Shuali. She looked at him and panted. "I really don't care." It would have been better if she hadn't said it. As soon as she said it, he pressed her down and continued to kiss her crazily. Even the clothes she was wearing couldn't escape. Chapter 35-21. After a long time, he let go of her and said in a low voice, "Bai Shuali, I never care about others." He didn't care about the process. He didn't care about a woman named Wen Yuan standing beside him. She might even become his fiancée. What he cared about was what Bai Shuali had said. What he cared about was the final result. They would grow old together. But she forgot. Hatred made her forget what he had said to her, and she didn't believe that he could do it. She said that she didn't care as long as she had money and status. Did that mean that she didn't care about him? He was hard on her, but he would be hard on her because he loved her. She raised her head and looked at him. Her little nose was red and she looked a little pitiful. Yi Mulin whispered, "I won't marry any woman." He didn't say anything else and just got up and covered her with the blanket. "Sleep for a while, I'll call you for dinner later." She lay down but couldn't fall asleep. She knew that she and Yi Mulin were like walking into a high-speed train. There was a limit to what he could control and what he could give her. There were many things that he couldn't decide himself. Actually, she didn't want it either. What else did the Bai and Yi Mulin have other than money and a body? No, there shouldn't be anything else. Bai Shuali laughed until her face was covered in tears. That night, he didn't mention it again and neither did she. He hugged her to sleep with a heavy heart. After one night, her stomach was much better and it didn't hurt anymore. Early in the morning, she told him that she was going to shoot a commercial. Yi Mulin had already gotten up and was tying his tie. When he heard her, he looked over. Bai Shuali sat on the bed, holding the bed sheets and looking down. I can't be with you forever, right? He slowed down and said, That's true, you won't be relying on me for the rest of your life. With that, he took off his tie and said in annoyance, But I'm not allowed to do the nude shoot. She nodded. I know. She knelt on the bed and he walked over to hand her the tie. She tied it for him gently. All right. She looked up. Are you coming over tonight? If not, I'll ask Cece out for dinner. Yi Mulin raised his hand to look at his watch. I won't be back for dinner, but I'll be back tonight. He paused, frowned, and suddenly asked, How are Lin Cece and Guze? Bai Shuali was a little surprised because Yi Mulin was not a gossipy person. She lowered her eyes. Just like that. It's about the same as us. But Cece doesn't want money. The last sentence sounded a little self-deprecating. Yi Mulin was silent for a while before he whispered, They will be together. She looked up, not quite understanding what he meant, but he had already left. She slowly sat up, put on her long coat and trousers, and walked downstairs to eat her breakfast. The servants of the family served them carefully at the side and introduced themselves. One was surnamed Li, and the other was surnamed Wang. Bai Shuali didn't hear it too clearly. She just smiled lazily and said, Just call me Miss Bai. I won't be staying for long. Maybe a few months, maybe a year. Chapter 35-22. Bai Shuali went to the set after breakfast. She was going to be on the cover of a second-rate magazine and it was an ethnic-style shoot. She had to place a lot of sand on the set and the script supervisor had to blow it up. She had eaten a lot of dust in the day and felt like her lungs were filled with sand when she breathed. At night, she asked Lin Cece for a good meal and complained as she ate. You're really risking your life for 10,000. She made a face as she said that. Lin Cece looked at her and said softly, I heard that you're with Yi Mulin again. Bai Shuali froze for a moment and then said, What do you mean by together? Isn't it just him paying me to sleep with him? Lin Cece felt bad. You can come to me if you need money. Shuali, are you not treating me as a friend anymore? She looked a little angry and Bai Shuali fell silent. After a long time, she smiled, her lips trembling. Cece, my mom needs tens of thousands a month, even more than 100,000. How much do you earn in a month? Yes, you do have some savings, but what will you do if you spend it all? What will your parents do? You still have to sleep with Guze. If you're going to sleep with him, why don't I do it instead? She said these spineless words and didn't even feel like she was saying anything. They were once the pride of the world, but now, none of them were stronger than the other. Their pride had long been trampled on. Cece, sleeping with a man you hate isn't that hard. It depends on how much he pays. Bai Shuali raised her head and held back her tears. I'll leave him when I have enough money. Don't worry. Lin Cece patted her. Don't worry. It's just sleeping, it's not a big deal. Bai Shuali smiled bitterly and took a sip of red wine. Cece, do you look down on me? Lin Cece shook her head and picked up the wine. Drink if you want to, just don't get drunk. The two girls drank until 10 at night before leaving the hotel. Lin Cece drove, but she couldn't drive because she was drunk and could only call a taxi. A taxi came and Bai Shuali asked Lin Cece to leave first as Cece had a business trip the next morning. As for herself, she didn't want to return to the golden cage immediately. She wanted to walk for a while more. But she only went down 2 steps when her gaze froze. She saw Yi Mulin. He was standing with a group of people. They were probably all big shots, and he stood among them naturally. Moreover, there was a very decent girl standing beside him. She was not old, and she looked like she was in her 20s. She was probably the girl his family was looking for him. She seemed to have heard his name on the phone the other day, that her name was Wen Yuan. Bai Shuali watched quietly as he said goodbye to those people, then held Wen Yuan's waist and walked to the car at the side. He drove an Audi today. It was very low-key, a car that she had never seen him drive before. He personally opened the door for Wen Yuan and helped her into the car. Just as he was about to close the door, he saw Bai Shuali. Bai Shuali also looked at him. She stood alone in the night wind blowing her hair, shielding her eyes. She thought it was good that way, no one would see her red eyes. It turned out that knowing and seeing were 2 different things. She thought that she didn't care at all, but it turned out that she still couldn't do it. She wanted to move her feet, but she couldn't move a single step. Yi Mulin's gaze was deep, his fingers holding the door and closing it gently, but he still looked at her, until Yi Xinggang called him softly from not far away. Mulin, send Wen Yuan back early. Yi Mulin's gaze was still fixed on Bai Shuali. About a minute later, he walked around the front of the car and opened the driver's door, not looking at Bai Shuali anymore. The car lights came on and drove away slowly. When he passed by Bai Shuali, she stood there, passing by him. Beside him sat Wen Yuan, who came from a good family. To Bai Shuali, this night was very cold, her hands and feet were cold. Yi Xinggang said a few words to the people beside him, then walked over slowly. Hao Yun was beside him. Miss Bai, I think you've seen it. Yi Xinggang sighed softly. You should be happy that Mulin has a better choice. The Wen family is very important to his career. You used to love him, and you want him to be well. You know in your heart that it's impossible for you 2 to be together. He said it sincerely. Bai Shuali suppressed the anger in her heart and gave him a smile. Uncle Yi is right. I can only be well if Yi Mulin is well, isn't it? Yi Xinggang's expression was a little disgusted, but he had been in politics for a long time, so he didn't show it on his face. He still said in a calm tone, you also have your own life. Think about the matter with Mulin again. Bai Shuali smiled slightly. Can I give you a price? I'll leave him for 20 million. Chapter 35-23. Yi Xinggang's expression changed slightly and he said coldly, don't you love him? Uncle Yi, don't you think it's ironic that you're talking to me about this now? Bai Shuali stood in the night wind and smiled slightly, the Bai family is over. What love do I have with Yi Mulin? She looked down and smiled faintly. Yi Xinggang looked at her and was suddenly touched. He actually saw a trace of Su Fu in Bai Shuali. She would not compromise for the sake of love and would not back down. He stared at her for a while, then stepped forward and said softly, Mulin has always been thinking about you, but you're from the Bai family. You should know what's most important to a man. It's his career, not his love. I'll give you this 20 million. Don't bother Mulin anymore. Bai Shuali was quiet and did not refute. The man in front of her had a grudge with her. It was an irreconcilable hatred. But she was not naive enough to think that she could take revenge. Just like what he said, she was from the Bai family. Yi Mulin was going to get engaged. Taking the money and finding a good nursing home for her mother was the best choice. After her father was released, there would be a place to stay. She needed too much money. Those setbacks and the darkness had long worn away her pride. Baishuali had never had a backbone. The only backbone she had was to throw a tantrum with Yi Mulin when he loved her. She never told Yi Mulin that she regretted it. She should have asked for 200 million when they divorced. That way, she would not have had to work so hard and her mother would not have to stay in the hospital alone. She was not humiliated. She even smiled and accepted the check that Yi Xingang asked Hao Yun to hand over. She even squeezed out a smile. "Thank you, Uncle Yi." She took the money and turned around. She slowly disappeared into the night. But no one saw the tears on her face. Yi Xingang was still standing where he was. Looking at the back of the stubborn girl, he lit a cigarette and said faintly, "Hao Yun, don't you think that Baishuali has changed? I always feel that if she is by Mulin's side, Mulin will be hurt by her sooner or later." Hao Yun smiled faintly. "You think too much." Yi Xingang glanced at him. "You didn't see how Mulin lost his composure when he saw her. Wen Yuan is also a smart kid. How could he not see it? If Wen Yuan knew that he was living with Baishuali, this marriage would be over sooner or later." Hao Yun hesitated for a moment before saying, "Perhaps the most important thing in Mulin's heart is not his career, but his ordinary life with the girl he likes. I saw him very happy before." "Yeah, he's very happy. I've never seen him so happy." Yi Xingang glanced at Hao Yun. "But a man should act like a man. You've seen the current situation. If we don't advance, we'll fall behind. If I retreat now, it would be strange if those who oppose me don't tear the Yi family to pieces." Hao Yun was speechless for a moment and sighed softly. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "Mulin has risen. It's time for me to retire." Yi Xingang was surprised. "Retire? What a joke, Hao Yun. You are in the prime of your life. Besides, there are too few trustworthy people now. Mulin can't do without you, and I can't do without you." Chapter 35-24. Hao Yun smiled faintly. "I want to pursue the life I want." Yi Xingang patted his shoulder. "What kind of life do you want?" Hao Yun thought for a while and said softly, "I want to go back to the university to teach, get a salary, and live a carefree life." "What about women? Don't you want women?" Yi Xingang smiled. "You brat, you haven't had a single serious girlfriend in the past few decades. I really wonder if you like men." Hao Yun laughed dryly. He looked at Yi Xingang and said softly, "I liked a senior when I was in school. She was 2 years older than me and quite pretty." Yi Xingang thought for a while. "When you were 2 years old, you were at the same age as Su Fu. You can ask her if you have a chance. She is married." Hao Yun said quickly. "But it's not a happy marriage." Yi Xingang smiled. "That means you still have a chance. You have to work hard." He patted Hao Yun and said, "Let's go to my place and get some drinks. We have something to discuss." Yi Mulin drove Wen Yuan home. Wen Yuan sat next to him and looked at his pale knuckles. He thought for a while and said, "Is that pretty girl your ex-wife?" Yi Mulin nodded. "Yes." Wen Yuan paused and said softly, "You still love her?" Yi Mulin didn't say anything and just drove calmly. The atmosphere in the car was a bit gloomy. Wen Yuan didn't ask any more. When the car stopped at the gate of the Wen family's house, Wen Yuan said, "You're going to take it that I don't say anything, right?" Yi Mulin said in a low voice, "I'm sorry." Wen Yuan sat in the car and said in a low voice, if I say I have the confidence to take you back and let you choose between me and her, would you be willing to try? Yi Mulin smiled and didn't say anything. He opened the car door and went around to open it for Wen Yuan. He whispered, "Good night." Wen Yuan looked up at him and smiled. She was a very smart person and understood what he meant. She was also confident. No matter how one looked at it, she was much stronger than Bai Shuali. Any smart man would know how to choose. But she hadn't thought that Yi Mulin would go to such an extent for Bai Shuali, and that this man could endure to such an extent. When she woke up, she realized that her expectations for him were just a distant dream. There was a kind of person who, once he set his mind on someone, no one else would be able to enter his heart. Yi Mulin was this kind of person. Wen Yuan, on the other hand, had regarded him as someone like Yi Xinggang. He had underestimated him and himself. Yi Mulin watched Wen Yuan leave with a dark look in his eyes. After he got into the car, he did not stop for even a second and drove to find Bai Shuali. She didn't pick up the phone, and when he returned to the villa, she didn't come back. He even went to her small apartment to look for her, but he still couldn't find her. At 1:00 in the morning, Hao Yun called and said quietly, "Mulin, Shuali took 20 million from your father in exchange for leaving you. Don't blame her. Tonight's situation was too embarrassing for her." Yi Mulin sat in the car, holding his phone. He couldn't hear what Hao Yun said after that. He only heard that she took 20 million and left him. He sat in the car and lit a cigarette. Hao Yun was right. He couldn't blame her, but he still had to blame her. Chapter 35-25. He searched for her like a madman, not letting go of any place. He should have left B City and returned to H City a long time ago. There were too many things for him to settle, but he couldn't just leave like that. She didn't go back to her apartment. That was right. With more than 20 million, she didn't need to stay in that kind of place anymore. In the end, he used a little bit of his power to find her at a filming site. She was actually still filming a commercial. It was a commercial for shampoo. Bai Shuali was wearing a bathrobe and lying in the bathtub. Her hair was wet and she was smiling with a bottle of shampoo in her hands. When Yi Mulin came in, there were people in front who had already cleared the place and chased away all the staff. The bodyguards dressed in black, who looked like evil spirits, scared the little reporters. One by one, they left, leaving only Bai Shuali in the bathtub. She wasn't afraid because she could guess who it was. After a while, Yi Mulin came over. His face was tense as he walked over. He stopped at the edge of the bathtub and looked down at her. Bai Shuali looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "You're very good," he said, "Bai Shuali." He was furious. He bent down and placed his hands on the edge of the bathtub. He stared at her eyes. "You're leaving me?" Bai Shuali smiled. "Why not? It's 20 million. Does Boss Yi know what 20 million means to me now? It means that my mom can lie in the hospital for 20 years. It means that I can give my dad a home when he comes back. Do you know how miserable he is? He fell from a high place, but he doesn't even have a home now. Our Bai family doesn't even have a house. You can ask for it from me." He narrowed his eyes and grabbed her neck. "What's the point of taking Yi Xinggang's money?" Bai Shuali stared at him and smiled. She said word by word, "That person, you'll call him Dad every day." He looked at her face and chuckled. "You really do hate me." "Why wouldn't I?" Bai Shuali's entire body was trembling, and her voice was shrill. "Your Yi clan destroyed my family and caused me to lose my child. Yi Mulin, do you know how much I looked forward to that child? The more I look forward to it, the more I hate you. Yes, it's you. His eyes reddened, and he loosened his grip on her as he took a step back. Bai Shuali chuckled softly. You can just be the powerful boss Yi. Why do you have to provoke me? Provoke me and go on a blind date with another woman in front of me. Yi Mulin, don't you think you're being too cruel? How big of a heart do I have to be with you? I slept with my enemy. I took your money, I took your father's money. Don't force me. Don't come looking for me again. Otherwise, I'll really do something irrational. I'll go out and sleep with them. As long as they give me money, I'll sleep with them. Would you still want me then? A slap came and hit her hard in the face. Her face was slapped to the side, and Yi Mulin's breathing was chaotic. He glared at her and spat out a few words. How dare you? After he said that, Bai Shuali's face slowly turned around. She reached out and touched the corner of her mouth gently. There was blood flowing from the corner of her mouth. This was the second time he had hit her. Chapter 35-26. She looked at him and slapped him in the face as well. He didn't avoid it and took it. They glared at each other like two injured animals, ready to tear each other apart at any moment. What happens to me has nothing to do with Leader Knight. She chuckled softly. I can live however I want. She tried to control herself, but her eyes were still red. We'll go our separate ways in the future. We don't owe each other anything. Let's not talk about loving each other. That's too hypocritical. She covered her face and wanted to leave, but she had only taken one step when he grabbed her back. He stared at her, his gaze cold. Then he took off his jacket, wrapped it around her, and carried her out. Bai Shuali screamed, Yi Mulin, what are you doing? You pervert! Let go of me, do you hear me? He acted as though he hadn't heard her. He continued to pat her butt. His car was parked at the entrance of the set. No one dared to look at him carrying her out. The door of the black limousine opened and he carried her in. He said to the driver, to the apartment in XX area. Bai Shuali froze for a moment before screaming, I don't want to go there. How could she go there? That was where he had lived with her for the past few months. She didn't want to go there, even if she died. But no matter how she struggled, he held her tightly. In the end, he trapped her in his arms and hugged her tightly. Her hair was against his chin. His voice was hoarse. If you move again, I'll strip you clean right now. She didn't move anymore. She just lay in his arms and cried silently. She didn't want to be weak, but she couldn't help it. How could he be so hateful and cruel? After a long time, she asked him softly, do you want to enjoy the bliss of having multiple partners? He didn't say anything, nor did he want to. Bai Shuali smiled bitterly and closed her eyes. When they reached the apartment, it was surprisingly clean. Someone must have cleaned it regularly. She was tired, so she closed her eyes and let him carry her to the bathroom. She thought they would have a cold war, and given his temper, he would ignore her for a long time. But he entered the bathtub with her and took her like crazy. He did it again and again from morning until night fell. Only when his blood ran dry did he let her go. Bai Shuali opened her eyes. It was pitch black outside, and he was no longer there. There was only the fragrance of food in the air. The familiar smell made her nose sour and she wanted to cry. It was disappointing, but she just wanted to cry. She got up and ate quietly. She didn't leave because her mother was in B City. She couldn't leave. Yi Mulin would find her eventually. She quietly sat there, the surroundings were extremely quiet. She seemed to be able to hear the sound of Little White crawling around. She suddenly walked towards the master bedroom and saw a small box on the cabinet by the door. Inside was a turtle about the same size as Little White. It was crawling around, and when it heard her footsteps, it raised its mung bean-like eyes and looked at her. Bai Shuali covered her mouth. Xiao Bai. However, this was no longer Whitey. Whitey was already dead. Even if Little Turtle looked exactly the same, it wouldn't be Little White. She gently picked up the little guy and chuckled. How about you call me Little White from now on? It's better to call me Little White. I'm used to it. Little White laid there and looked at her with its mung bean-like eyes. Bai Shuali said softly, Little White, I'm your mother from now on. As she said that, she felt her nose sour. Actually, she had lost 2 children, Little White and the one in her stomach. Chapter 35-27. Yi Mulin's car drove back to the main house of the Yi family in the middle of the night. He hadn't been here for a long time. He pushed open the car door and walked into the house. The servants in the house were all stunned, eldest young master. My dad is in the study room. Yi Mulin was cold and noble as he slowly walked towards the study room. The servant nodded, Elder Yi is at home. Yi Mulin stood at the door of his father's study room. His face was slightly tense. He put down his hands and pushed the door open. Yi Xinggang was smoking. When he looked at Yi Mulin, his gaze turned cold. Why are you back? Yi Mulin walked straight over and placed a check on Yi Xinggang's desk. He said softly, 20 million. With that, he turned around and left. Yi Xinggang looked down at the check. It was signed by Yi Mulin. He picked it up and said in a deep voice, What is this? Are you going to be with Wen Yuan and raised by Shuali at the same time? Yi Mulin turned around and looked at his father, Can't I? Dad, didn't you do the same? On one hand, you and my mother are loving husband and wife, while on the other hand, you are raising Xia and Ning outside. The villa she lives in was bought by you, right? Yi Xinggang was so angry that his face turned white. Just as he was about to get angry, Yi Mulin sneered, I'm just carrying out Dad's spirit, am I wrong? With that, he left. Yi Xinggang clutched his chest. The pain was unbearable. At this moment, he realized with horror that he seemed to have lost the eldest son he was most proud of. In Yi Mulin's heart, he had destroyed everything for his mother and destroyed his marriage. He was a complete bastard. Yi Xinggang fell on the sofa and laughed. What did he do wrong? He just did what anyone in his position would do. Wasn't the person beside him like that? Who wouldn't want to take a step forward when they were in his position? He couldn't do it. He was about the same age, but Yi Mulin was so young and outstanding. He just wanted his son to be more outstanding. He just wanted his son to look down on everyone. Was he wrong? He was not wrong at all. He had Xia Anning, but he had always been good to Su Fu, and only had Su Fu in his heart. Xia Anning was just playing along. But he forgot that this was just a casual play, and it lasted far too long, so long that the woman couldn't bear it. Yi Mulin left the Yi mansion and drove back to the apartment. He smoked a few cigarettes downstairs and wanted to calm down. He had not thought of how to face Bai Shuali. Something his father had said had touched him. Mulin, do you want to date Wen Yuan and support Bai Shuali at the same time? After smoking 4 cigarettes, he decided to take her away and bring her to H City. B City had Wen Yuan and his father. There were too many factors that made Shuali feel unsafe. He wanted to take her away. At this time, Yi Mulin had no confidence in the future, but he had to persevere, for her, and for the shattered Bai family behind her. If the Bai family was really destroyed, it would be impossible for them to be together. He got out of the car and threw the cigarette butt away. His calf leather shoes stepped on the ground a few times. His movements were very, very slow. After a long time, he walked into the elevator. When he reached the apartment, Baishuali was still there. She had eaten and the dishes were washed clean. In the warm room, she wore his sweater and sat on the sofa. On the coffee table was Xiao Xiao Bai. For a moment, Yi Mulin felt as though he had returned to the past, back to their best time. It was as though nothing had happened. She was still the willful Baishuali that made his heart ache. She was still the worm that he raised. Chapter 35-28. He took off his coat, walked over slowly and sat beside her. Come to H City with me tomorrow morning. Baishuali looked at him. Yi Mulin. He was still staring at her. I gave the 20 million to your father. Then, he stroked her chin with his fingers and pinched it. You're mine now. She swatted his hand away. I'm not yours. Yi Mulin stared at her for a moment and got up indifferently. Then you can try to see if you can still stay in B City and if the 20 million is still yours. She was furious. Despicable. He stood at the door of the bedroom and turned around gently. When Yuan won't be between us? She asked sarcastically, you mean that she won't appear in front of us, right? Then, she chuckled. Yi Mulin, you're mistaken. You should promise when Yuan this. I'm really insignificant. Yi Mulin unbuttoned his shirt, one button at a time. Then, his hands stopped. He walked over and stopped in front of her. He bent down and leaned in front of her. His voice was low and husky. Don't you care? He pinched her jaw and said in a hoarse voice, who was the one who stood in the wind and didn't move for a long time that night. Really? Baishuali tilted her head. What about you? Did you give Wen Yuan a goodnight kiss after you saw me? Or did you get impotent when you had sex with her that night? He pinched her chin and didn't explain, but his face was livid. His expression was cold. Baishuali, it's pretty good. He chuckled. I'll let you know if I'm impotent or not. Baishuali gritted her teeth and reached out to stop him. I don't want it, Yi Mulin. I don't want it. Do you hear me? How could he hear her? He was angry at this moment. He wanted her to take back all those unpleasant words. The sofa was very soft and could accommodate 2 adults. He pressed her down and didn't let her move. His beautiful thin lips pressed against her ear and he said in a low voice, You don't want it? Tell me later if you want it or not, okay? Probably out of anger, he pinched her chin and kissed her fiercely. That kind of kiss that went all the way to the bottom made her hurt and uncomfortable. Baishuali clenched her fists and punched his shoulders, but to him, it was as insignificant as cotton candy. He kissed her fiercely and his large hands moved down, so forcefully that it hurt her. No. She turned her face to the side, but he followed her again and kissed her madly. She was in so much pain and discomfort that she couldn't take it anymore and bit his lips. Yi Mulin left her lips and looked at her deeply. His voice was low and hoarse. Baishuali. She panted and looked at his slightly red eyes helplessly. She was a little scared. He was rarely like this. In the past, when they were just married, he was rough, but definitely not like this. He stared at her, then lowered his head and bit down hard on her lips. She groaned, but did not dare to move. He bit her again. Her body trembled as she watched him bite after bite. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and cried out, Yi Mulin, don't. He controlled his strength well and didn't make her bleed. But that strength made her want to cry and scream. Chapter 35-29. She widened her eyes and shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. Yi Mulin looked at her. She thought he would continue, but he didn't. He just lowered his body and buried his face in her neck, saying hoarsely, "There won't be anyone else." In the place where they used to live, it must have touched the softness in her heart. Perhaps he was so fragile. Then, they did it on the sofa in the living room. More than once. When it ended, it was already late. She curled up in his arms, saying softly, "I want to see my mother tomorrow." She knew she couldn't escape. It wasn't that she was resigned to her fate, but she was willing to accompany him if he had the money. 20 million wasn't that easy to get. After she said that, Yi Mulin said calmly, "I'll go with you." "No need." She said it quickly. Then, she seemed to realize something and said slowly, "That place isn't suitable for you to go now." Yi Mulin didn't say anything more. He hugged her and wanted to smoke, but he didn't because of her body. After a while, he suddenly asked, "Is your stomach still uncomfortable?" She couldn't take the medicine and it was a little urgent today, so she didn't take any precautions. Baishuali felt embarrassed by such a question and said softly, "It's all right, it's not too uncomfortable." With that, she bit her lip. "I'm tired, I want to sleep." He no longer bothered her, but he knew very well in his heart that she was no longer the Baishuali of the past. She no longer chatted with him for a long time. She no longer told him how Yi Mulin was doing today and what she did today. She no longer asked him what happened today. She no longer said that she missed Yi Mulin so much after only half a day, she wouldn't. There was only panic and alienation in her eyes. He didn't know if she still loved him. The emotion she showed that night might have been because of disappointment. Yi Mulin opened his eyes, waiting for the sun to rise. In the past year, she had lost a lot of weight and he had lost a lot of weight too, but she didn't realize it. Did she no longer have him in her heart? They woke up almost at the same time. Yi Mulin looked at her and smiled faintly. "I'm going to make breakfast." Since when did he learn to deceive himself and treat it as when they were still husband and wife? Indeed, the moment he said that, she smiled faintly and said, "Let me do it." After all, leader Yi spent money. I have to make her feel at home. Yi Mulin was displeased. "I've always been here." "What about you, Baishuali?" "We are divorced. I don't dare to climb up the social ladder. After all, Elder Yi will be the son-in-law of the Wen family in the future. I have to avoid arousing suspicion," she said mockingly. After saying that, she wanted to get up. However, a hand pulled her into his embrace and hugged her tightly. His hot breath was right beside her ears as he murmured, "Baishuali, I really want to kill you." "That's right. If we destroy the night market, we won't have to work so hard. I'm afraid that your body won't be able to handle 2 women alone." She was courting death. "Night market?" Yi Mulin let go of her coldly. "You can try." Chapter 35-30. In the end, he still pressed her down and forced her to lie down. He said in a low voice, "I'll do it." He glanced at her, his eyes filled with warning. Baishuali's answer was to turn around. He really wanted to kill her like that, but he couldn't bear to do it. He made breakfast for her and when he was done, he wanted to wake her up. She had already gotten up to brush her teeth and wash her face, ready to come out. They met at the door and looked at each other silently for a while. He said, "You can bring the things you left here to H City if you like them." With that said, he walked in, sat on the bed and pulled open the drawer gently. The moment he pulled it open, he went into a daze. Inside were her bank cards, their wedding rings, and the bracelet he had bought for her. She didn't want them and they were all inside. Bai Shuali looked at him and then at the things and shook her head. I don't want them. Yi Mulin stared at her and said slowly, Bai Shuali, actually, you don't want me in your heart, right? If you weren't short of money, you wouldn't even bother to look at me. No. She smiled. She smiled. After all, Se is beautiful and has a good job. No woman feels wronged sleeping with Se. I'm not that noble. It's better to be with you than with those old men. She said nonchalantly, when I was working at the nightclub, I always thought that one day you would see me, that you would miss me, that your heart would ache for me, and that you would take me away from that place. Yi Mulin, you overestimate me. I don't have that much backbone. I'm just like what you thought I was, shallow and without substance. She said so much in one go, but he just looked at her with a deep gaze. He lowered his head and picked up the ring, looked at it and put it back. In the end, he still took the bracelet and walked over. He held her hand and put it on for her. He looked at her deeply. If you dare to take it off, I guarantee that you will regret it and beg me to put it on myself. His words were full of threats, but there was also a hint of evil in them, which immediately made her think of what had happened in bed. She put her hand down silently and didn't say anything. Yi Mulin didn't say much and just stuffed Xiao Bai into her hands. Take good care of him this time, don't let him die. She sniffled and looked up. Yi Mulin, don't you have a heart? Don't you care about the past? His heart was hit hard. He stared at her for a while and smiled lightly. Yes, I don't have a heart. But Bai Shuali, how can I keep thinking about the past? That's what weaklings do. He knew very well that she was talking about the child she had lost. How could he not be sad? But he never mentioned it, because he wanted to forget her, he wanted them to start over. He remembered and mentioned it so that she wouldn't forget. Bai Shuali bit her lip and didn't say anything else. She quietly finished her breakfast. He brought her out without any luggage. It seemed like he was going to buy something for her in H City. The car was driven by Hao Yun. Bai Shuali felt uneasy, but Yi Mulin didn't say anything. She couldn't figure out if Hao Yun was on Yi Mulin's side or Yi Xinggang's. Chapter 35-31. The car drove all the way to the sanatorium. Yi Mulin didn't follow her but just got off the car to smoke. Hao Yun also got off the car and lit a cigarette beside him. He said calmly, have you thought it through? Will your father agree to bring her back to H City? And the Wen family? Yi Mulin's voice was low. He turned his head and looked at Hao Yun. It's not me who can't back down now. It's my father. He took a puff of the cigarette and said calmly, no matter whether she hates me or not, no matter whether the time is right or not, I will keep her by my side. Love and hate together. With that, he lowered his head and said softly, because a lifetime is so long, I can't wait. He looked at Hao Yun and smiled faintly. Uncle Hao, I'm not like you who can wait for a person for a lifetime. I just want to keep her by my side and touch her every day. Hao Yun was a little surprised. Yi Mulin looked at the clouds in the sky and said indifferently, I don't care about this. It's up to my mother. He was definitely not trying to please Hao Yun for himself. It was because his mother and father's relationship had broken up and it was impossible to return to the past. Why bother? He said that a lifetime was so long and there was no need to make things difficult for himself. He should be with the person he liked. Hao Yun let out a long sigh. He didn't know what to say for a moment. In the end, he only said one sentence, I'll do my best. Yi Mulin's voice was very soft. If Wen Yuan is not willing, I may spend a few more years without the Wen family. But so what? I'm determined to keep her by my side. We will be the ones who will be entangled for a lifetime. I won't have anyone else. Hao Yun was stunned for a moment and patted his shoulder. You're different from your father. He hesitated for a moment and then asked, what about the future? What if you succeed? Retire. Go back to being a lawyer. With a complicated and ambiguous smile, Yi Mulin looked at Hao Yun and said, I have two interests and hobbies. One is to be a lawyer, and the other is Bai Shuali. Obviously, Bai Shuali is much more interesting, so it is not a pity to sacrifice the other one. Hao Yun sighed. Yes, it's not a pity. He smiled. But I'm going to teach in the future. I just don't know if she's willing to follow a poor teacher. Yi Mulin smiled and said nothing. Actually, Hao Yun came from a family of scholars. How could he be a poor teacher? He had earned quite a lot over the years. However, Hao Yun knew when to stop. He was a good person who kept a low profile. On the 5th floor of the sanatorium, Bai Shuali swiped 2 million yuan in one go. In addition to a year's hospitalization fees, she also paid for a specialist consultation fee. The hospital hired a foreign specialist for Mrs. Bai. She hoped that when her father came out, her mother would be well. No one could replace the company of the other half, so she wanted to cure her mother, even if she had to sleep with Yi Mulin. Now, Bai Shuali no longer had the courage to refuse money. After paying, she went to see Mrs. Bai and carefully opened the door. Mrs. Bai was doing cross-stitch with her head down. Bai Shuali felt a lump in her throat. Looking at her mother's serious face, she remembered that her mother used to say that this was what poor women did to kill time. Women should spend their time in beauty salons or shopping malls. But now, she was doing it alone. It was quiet and there was no one around. Chapter 35-32. She walked over and squatted down beside Mrs. Bai. She gently placed her hand beside her leg. Mom, I'm lonely too. Can you get better soon? Mrs. Bai looked up at her and then lowered her head to continue with her embroidery. She muttered as she embroidered, when I'm done, Xiangnan will come out. He'll come out. He'll go back to the past. She couldn't stop talking. Bai Shuali's heart ached as she listened. For Mrs. Bai, it was like a dream. And Mrs. Bai didn't want to wake up from this dream. Was it good or bad to cure her? Bai Shuali thought that it was better. No matter how good a dream was, it was just a dream. She got up and held her mother's head in her arms. She whispered, Mom, I'm leaving. I'm going somewhere far away. But I'll come back to see you. I promise. Mrs. Bai kept saying, you won't come back. If you leave, you won't come back. Xiangnan hasn't come back for such a long time. Bai Shuali won't come back either. Mom, I'll come back. Bai Shuali's voice was trembling. She gently stroked her mother's white hair. In the past, her mother loved beautiful women the most. She didn't have a single white hair. But now, there were many white hairs. She was a little sad and left slowly. Her mother didn't recognize her anymore. Maybe she didn't want to recognize her. Bai Shuali smiled softly. Her smile was bitter. When she went downstairs, she walked slowly to Yi Mulin's car. But she still turned back to look at the hospital. Mrs. Bai was standing on the balcony unknowingly. Bai Shuali looked at her and shouted, Mom, go back. Mrs. Bai waved at her. Come back. Remember to come back. Don't be like Xiangnan and not come back. Her face, which had always been well maintained, looked very haggard. She was no longer as beautiful as before. Bai Shuali's voice was choked. Mom, I'll come back. Hurry up and go back. At this time, 2 nurses came over and brought Mrs. Bai back to her ward. Bai Shuali stood there and stared at her for a long time. Yi Mulin walked over and said softly, "Let's go." She didn't look at him. She just sat in the car and didn't speak on the way to the airport. Yi Mulin was very busy, so he took a private plane. As soon as he arrived in H City, he arranged for her to take her to her residence and then went to work. It was Secretary Li who came to pick them up. She drove a green Beetle and said to Bai Shuali, "Mrs. Yi, Lawyer Yi now lives in Sinan Mansion." Shuali leaned on the back seat and whispered, "Call me Miss Bai, or Shirley. And is also Lawyer Yi." "He is not Yi." "Yi." Shuali bit her. And said. Li. Shuali smiled. And looked. Bai. While. Li and Shuali. For a moment, Secretary Li didn't know what to say. She just drove the car to the front of a villa in Sinan Mansion with a smile. When she opened the door for Bai Shuali had already opened the door and got off. Bai. Bye-bye. Bai Lon has. Was. Bai. Secretary Li finally heard that she was concerned about Yi Mulin. She said happily, "No, Leader Yi has been living in the office's lounge. He doesn't have a special place to live." Bai Shuali was a little surprised, but she didn't ask. She walked into the villa slowly. Chapter 35-33. Secretary Li stood in the hall and introduced it enthusiastically. "I found the house. I know Miss Bai will like it. Is it comfortable?" "It's very good, thank you," Bai Shuali said lightly. Secretary Li was actually a bit disappointed. Mrs. Yi was different from before. After the blow, she was not as lively as before. In fact, it was quite pitiful for her to fall from such a high place. And she heard that Boss Yi was going to have a fiancé soon, and Mrs. Yi was now a mistress in H City. Life was unpredictable. Secretary Li cheered up. "By the way, there is also a servant here. She will not disturb Miss Bai's life." After saying that, she squeezed out a bitter smile. "Can I call her Shuali?" Bai Shuali nodded and found a suitable place to put Little White down. Then, she fed it something. Secretary Li gave her a car key. "That car was prepared for you by Boss Yi." Bai Shuali was stunned for a moment, but then she chuckled. "He is quite considerate. This car is a famous mistress car. Doesn't your boss know?" Secretary Li smiled awkwardly and said, "I really don't know about that." Bai Shuali smiled again and said with a bit of loneliness, "It's nothing much. It suits my current identity quite well." She didn't ask Secretary Li to come down and walked around the villa alone for a long time. In fact, it felt good to be kept by a man. At least she didn't have to work so hard. She lay down and slept for a while. When she woke up, the servants made delicious dishes, which made her feel even more comfortable being kept by them. Even if this man hurt her and his family hurt the Bai family. So what? She needed money. She stretched out her hand and looked at the bracelet on her wrist. She smiled faintly. Self-esteem meant nothing to her now. She called Yi Mulin. He was in a meeting when he received the call. He was surprised that she would call him. "What's wrong?" His voice had a rare gentleness to it. His subordinates were as shocked as they could be. This new boss Yi was a cruel and merciless king of hell. He was not easy to fool. It was said that he had been in H City for more than a year and slept in the office every day. Now there was a woman on the other side of the phone. It was like the sun rose from the west. So leader Yi is also a man and has a man's needs. Everyone let out a long sigh of relief. It was good that they had the 7 emotions and 6 jades. It was good that they had the 7 emotions and 6 jades. Yi Mulin asked. Bai Shuali's voice was a little soft. I want to go out for a walk. He said, okay, I'll come back early tonight to accompany you. I want to go now, she said a little willfully. This willfulness would have annoyed any other man, but Yi Mulin was stunned for a moment. His heart was numb, and he couldn't describe the feeling, as if he was living a new life. His voice was husky and very sexy. Then I'll ask Hao Yun to send it over to you. Be good and wait at home. She grunted. Yi Mulin immediately hung up and looked at Hao Yun, come out for a moment. Hao Yun had already guessed that only Bai Shuali could make Yi Mulin be so unprincipled. He followed him out. Yi Mulin handed him a card and whispered, send this to Shuali. She lives in Sinan Mansion. Chapter 35-34. Yi Mulin frowns and says in a low voice, but it will be very hard for her to be alone outside. I can't bear to do that. Hao Yun doesn't say anything more. He chuckles and says, I see. He sends the card in person because Mulin is reluctant and worried about others. In Sinan Mansion, he sees Bai Shuali. At that time, Bai Shuali is sitting on the sofa watching TV, holding a small plate of fruit in her hand. She looks a little different from what he saw in B City. She is much more relaxed. At Hao Yun's age, he is a sentimental person, so he can naturally see the difference and know that it is definitely not because Bai Shuali changes her mind or because she loves him. It is just that the hatred has reached the extreme. After that night, all the love and hatred may disappear. What is the use of loving and hating a man who is going to be engaged to someone else? Hao Yun gives the card to Bai Shuali. He doesn't leave immediately, but whispers, don't hurt Mulin. Bai Shuali shrinks on the sofa with a small cluster of flames in her eyes. She says lightly, I don't understand what Mr. Hao said. I hurt him. She lowers her eyes, and her long eyelashes are like a small feather fan. How can I hurt him? I am unarmed. Hao Yun is unmoved. He loves you. The only one in the world who can hurt him is you. You actually know it in your heart, but you pretend not to understand it. Bai Shuali smiles bitterly. I don't dare to understand it. She looks straight at Hao Yun. Hao Yun thinks for a moment that he is harsh to her. The Bai family has lost everything. She will not feel good being protected by her ex-husband like this. Hao Yun's voice is lower. You have to believe him. Bai Shuali sat on the sofa for a long time and didn't move. She didn't even touch the fruit in her hand. The servant came over and asked her softly if she wanted a cup of tea. She said that she didn't need it. She said that she was going out. That day, she went out and spent a few $1 million. She signed a mountain of branded bags and clothes. Yi Mulin received some bank statements from time to time. He was slightly distracted during the meeting and then switched his phone to silent mode. When the meeting was over, he took a quick look at it but did not say anything. He did not call Bai Shuali either. By the time he finished his work and went back, it was already 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. Before he went back, he called her, and his voice was gentle. Shirley, are you back? Do you want me to pick you up? He was obedient to her. There was love and compensation, but in his heart, he knew that no amount of money could make up for the child she had lost. Bai Shuali's voice was hoarse. I drove out. I'll be back in a while. Yi Mulin said softly, we can eat outside and then go home together. Go home. Bai Shuali was in a daze for a while before she smiled softly, Leader Yi, is your identity okay? He hung up the phone. This was one of the rare times he lost his composure. Because he was angry that she called him Leader Yi, he hated it when she called him that in such a mocking tone. Every time she called him that, he felt that she would never forgive him in this life. On the other side, she did not call again. However, Yi Mulin received a huge bank statement. It was more than 8 million. Chapter 35-35. He returns to Sinan Mansion and takes off his coat. The servant immediately comes over, Mr. Yi, Miss Bai said that she won't come back for dinner. Do you want to eat now? Yi Mulin sits down and rubs his eyebrows, help me make a cup of tea. I'll eat with Miss Bai later. The servant is a little hesitant. Miss Bai said that she won't come back for dinner. But since the host said so, she can't say anything, so she goes to make a cup of tea. So the tea is brewed and cooled. It's not until 10 o'clock that Bai Shuali comes back. She walks into the hall and sees Yi Mulin sitting on the sofa as if he is waiting for her, but his eyebrows are twisted as if he is very tired. So she puts down the bag in her hand and sits beside him. She puts her hand on his shoulder and leans over with a flattering look, are you waiting for me? Yi Mulin opens his eyes and stares at her. His eyes are full of red blood. Her heart hurts fiercely, but she doesn't show it. Under the luxurious crystal lamp, her appearance is still the same, but not as simple as before. Yi Mulin stared at her little face and kissed her forcefully. She was dragged into his arms and kissed him forcefully. She sat on his lap like a pitiful kitten. She punched him in the shoulder and whispered, someone will see. He kisses her for a long time regardless of anything. She can feel the anger in this kiss. After the kiss, she falls on his shoulder breathlessly. Her fingers move restlessly on his neck, and her voice is a little coquettish. Are you angry with me because I came back late or because I spent a lot of money? He looks at her little face with burning eyes. At this time, the touch under his palm tells him that she is really in his arms. Without saying anything, he directly holds her and carries her upstairs. Bai Shuali leaned on his shoulder and giggled. You haven't eaten yet, right? You're busy making love. You have, she holds his handsome face and smiles charmingly, how hungry you are. Her little finger gently pokes his heart, is Wen Yuan sexually apathetic? Yi Mulin stares at her. His voice is hoarse, you can mention her if you are not afraid of death. She was still laughing heartlessly. I'm afraid your body can't take it. The night is long. He hit her hard. She cried out and wrapped her arms around his neck. But I'm hungry. I haven't eaten anything for half a day. The food outside is too sweet. I can't get used to it. He had already reached the second floor, but he stopped and looked at her. Won't you cook for me? She asked coquettishly in a soft voice, and tried her best to torment him. She clearly knew that he was very tired, that he had been in a meeting for almost a day, and that he had been waiting at home for a few hours, but she still made such an unreasonable request. Hao Yun said he loved her, so she wanted to see how long his love would last and how far it would go. She laughed coldly in her heart. Yi Mulin stared at her little face for a while, but his voice was unexpectedly gentle. You want to eat my cooking? She replied, I've been walking around for half a day. I'm tired. She nestled in his arms. Would I be too much? I heard that women who are kept by others serve men. He let go of her and walked downstairs, but he said to her, you can serve me on the bed. Chapter 35-36. Bai Shuali looked at his back view and bit her fingers. He was clearly unhappy. Of course, she knew that he wasn't unhappy because of the money. After all, Yi Mulan's assets were worth at least tens of billions. He was just unhappy because she wasn't at home with him. He was unhappy because she didn't love him anymore. Love? She chuckled softly. It was a bitter smile. She walked down and saw Yi Mulan standing in the kitchen alone, cooking. His back was still very nice and suitable for Asian women to lean on. However, she didn't dare to lean on him anymore. After watching for a while, she decided to go back to the living room and stretched her body. Actually, being a sugar baby wasn't as bad as she thought it would be. Having a man who still had feelings for you was, in a sense, a blissful life as long as you could get over it. She curled up on the sofa and picked up a magazine to read. She threw it away as though it was scalding hot. It was a medical magazine and it was in English. It mainly talked about her mother's illness. Her gaze was complicated as she looked up at the man in the kitchen and bit her lips. Yi Mulan walked over with a glass of juice. Drink a little first. She curled up on the sofa and looked at him, saying softly, Yi Mulan, was it a coincidence or did you read the magazine on purpose? She knew how busy he was. However, she found it funny and pitiful that he still took time out to study this illness. She stared at him as though she was in a hurry to find an answer. However, his gaze was calm as he said, "You're with me now. It's only right for me to help you or your mother." Her gaze dimmed and she took the juice. After taking a sip, she chuckled. Thankfully, Boss Yi only has one. Otherwise, he might be very busy. He looked at her, said nothing, and continued to cook. The dishes were all her favorites and he barely touched his chopsticks. Bai Shuali ate for a while and looked at him. Why aren't you eating? He lit a cigarette and said without leaving the dining table, I don't have much of an appetite. You eat. All right, they weren't related and she shouldn't care about him. She continued to eat and washed the dishes. When he came out, Yi Mulan was already in the study, but the door was not closed. She leaned forward in the doorway. He looked up at her, but returned to his business. Bai Shuali heaved a sigh of relief. He was really busy, even busier than when he was a lawyer. He had money and looks, but what was he after? Of course, she wouldn't ask. She went to the bedroom to wash up and check her trophies. After a while, she casually threw them into the drawer. Yi Mulan slept in the wee hours of the morning. She thought that since he had been busy the whole day and they had done it last night, he wouldn't have the energy to do it. However, after he came out of the bathroom, he lifted the covers and kissed her. He was a little rude and didn't give her any buffer time like before. As expected, he was still angry. She sighed softly. Yi Mulan kissed her fiercely. He pulled away her silk pajamas and dragged her out of the quilt. She didn't fall asleep, but that didn't mean she wanted him to do this to her. Yi Mulan, it's cold. She complained and hugged herself, not letting him touch her. Chapter 35-37. She even sweated a little after a while. She didn't know if it was because of the heater or because his body was too hot. After a few times, he finally let her go. She curled up in the quilt and closed her eyes to catch her breath. She said in a low voice, "You don't eat. Where do you get so much energy?" Yi Mulan was still hugging her and nibbling her neck. He heard her words and smiled, "You care about me." She closed her eyes and smiled gently, "I don't care. I'm just curious." She opened her eyes and poked his heart, "And your muscles?" He used to have a good figure, but he had lost a lot of weight recently. But his passion didn't decrease, and he became a little more rough. Yi Mulin looked down at her. His eyes were as dark as the night. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "Baishuali, is it so hard to admit that you care about me?" She bit her lip and turned her back. "No way." He looked at her back and then went to take a shower. When he returned to the bed, his stomach was a little uncomfortable and painful. But he endured it and lay quietly beside her. He also endured her alienation. He knew that no amount of money and love could exchange for her trust. In her heart, the Yi family was the murderer who destroyed the Bai family. He, Yi Mulin, was also the murderer. Wasn't it pretentious and ridiculous to talk to her about pain now? He had been enduring it silently until he couldn't stand it anymore. He got up gently and went to the study to take the medicine. Stomach pain was his old problem. It often happened in the past year, but he didn't take it seriously. He only knew how to work until he stood at the highest peak. His illness was never his weakness. Bai Shuali's was. He was afraid to wake her up, so he made do on the sofa in the study for the night. At dawn, he called the doctor. Hao Yun also came over. He was a little nervous when he saw the doctor gave him a painkiller and gave him medicine. When the doctor left, he looked at Yi Mulin firmly. "Mulin, you must go to the hospital for examination. You can't delay it like this." "I'm fine." Yi Mulin put on his coat. "Let's go to the office." Hao Yun wanted to say something but stopped. He looked at the blanket in the study room and knew that he had spent the night there. He lowered his voice and said, "Where's Bai Shuali? Doesn't she know that you're sick?" Yi Mulin was taken aback. Then, he said uncomfortably, "She doesn't know, and I don't want her to know." Hao Yun gritted his teeth. "You should tell her. Mulin, I've already told you that you're working too hard. You're carrying her alone, and she still hates you. Why are you doing this?" However, Yi Mulin waved his hand and said in a light voice, "I don't care about these things. Moreover, I don't want to make things difficult for her. She's fine the way she is now. At least when she was unhappy, she could take it out on him instead of making things difficult for herself." Hao Yun disagreed, but there was nothing he could do. Before he left, he met Bai Shuali. His voice was a little faint. "Shuali, be fair to him. He has never done anything wrong. If there's anything wrong, it's that he likes you. But what's wrong with liking someone? He's already shouldered too much." Bai Shuali stood there, her face a little pale. She knew when the doctor came in the morning, but she was in no position to care about him. Hao Yun continued, "He has stomach problems. His stomach will hurt when he doesn't eat. You should take care of him in the future." Chapter 35-38. Hao Yun was a little angry. "Do you still have a heart? Do you know that he did that for you, Uncle Hao? Stop it. Don't talk about it anymore." Yi Mulin appeared out of nowhere and said calmly, "He went to the general office." Hao Yun could only sigh. He could not say anything and could not say anything. After he left, Yi Mulin looked at Bai Shuali and said, "It's an old illness, it's fine. There are so many people who care about your illness, including me." Bai Shuali said indifferently and returned to the bedroom. Yi Mulin stood there, his expression a little ugly and disappointed. Bai Shuali suddenly turned her head. He was still there. Their eyes met and there was an unconcealable awkwardness in his eyes. She lightly pursed her lips and didn't say anything else. She just turned her head away, and it seemed like she was doing it on purpose. Yi Mulin did not say anything and turned to leave. He could only leave. It would be embarrassing to stay. When the door closed, Baishuali turned her head back immediately. Her eyes were a little red and she bit her lips. She thought about his body from last night. He had lost at least 5 kilograms and yet he did not eat. Was he trying to starve himself to gain sympathy? He was already so old and he still wanted to play the trick of suffering. She did not want sympathy or heartache. He was no one to her. She lowered her head and stood there, unable to move for a long time. Her heart was numb. Her mind was filled with images of him not eating, and the next moment, he was smoking and doing his work. Had he been living like this for the past year? Her heart was throbbing in pain. It was very uncomfortable. She picked up the phone in her hand and searched on Baidu, stomachache. Her eyes searched for the entry, page by page. After she finished reading, she was at a loss. Why did he not eat? Why did his stomach ache? Why did he work so hard? Did he like power that much? Her father had climbed so high, but didn't he fall as well? Baishuali bit her lips and smiled uncomfortably. That day, Yi Mulin did not call her and neither did she. However, she did not go shopping. Actually, she should not have gone shopping. She just changed her clothes and lay on the bed. She couldn't ignore Hao Yun's words. He asked her to be fair. How was she going to be fair? Reconcile with Yi Mulin. How could they reconcile? There was the grudge between the Bai and Yi families, and there was also Wen Yuan. She felt extremely uncomfortable. The feeling that assaulted her face almost drowned her, making it hard for her to breathe. But she still had to endure it. At night, Yi Mulin did not come back. She woke up in the middle of the night and felt cold all around her. She had a nightmare, but there was no warm body beside her. She didn't know if he was working or doing something else. She thought about it for a long time and finally made a call. She said in a low voice, "Yi Mulin, have you eaten?" There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then, he said in a low voice, "I'm working overtime. I've eaten." His voice was raspy and strange. She did not think too much about it, thinking that it was because it was late at night. After stuttering for a while, she whispered, "Then I'll hang up." "Oh right, are you coming back tonight?" He seemed to be stunned for a moment before saying, "I'm not going back. I might be back in a few days. You, take care of yourself." With that, he hung up the phone. Chapter 35-39. She stared at her phone in a daze for a long time before putting it down slowly. When she laid down again, she couldn't fall asleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she would see Yi Mulin sitting in the study. Just like that, she lay there until dawn. She decided to make a call to check on him. His phone was switched off. She sat on the bed and thought for a moment. Then, she dialed Secretary Li's number. As soon as Secretary Li received the call, she said directly, "Boss Yi is sick. He went to the hospital last night." Baishuali was stunned again. She didn't come back to her senses for a long time. Secretary Li whispered the hospital and ward number. "Thank you." Baishuali put down her phone and sat on the bed in a daze. She was conflicted. She didn't know if she should visit him. She thought that since he was her, she should at least visit him. At 9 in the morning, she appeared at the door of the ward. She placed her hand on the doorknob, still hesitating. Just as she was hesitating, the door opened and Hao Yun walked out. Hao Yun had left in a hurry. He seemed to have some work to do. After all, Yi Mu Yun was in the hospital. Hao Yun would be very busy as the Secretary General. He looked at Baishuali and paused. "His stomach problem is serious. You should persuade him to go for surgery." Bai Shuali looked down. Where is he? Hao Yun's expression was complicated. He hesitated for a moment before saying, he's inside. Bai Shuali bit her lip and pushed the door open. But the moment she opened the door, she saw Yi Mulin and Wen Yuan inside. They weren't close. Yi Mulin was sitting on the sofa with a jacket on, reading some documents. Wen Yuan handed him a glass of water. Yi Mulin took it and didn't say anything. He continued to read the documents in his hands. Wen Yuan sat down softly at the side. Bai Shuali stood at the door. Her face was pale. She wasn't stupid. She knew what it meant for Wen Yuan to come and get close to Yi Mulin to not reject him. It meant that they were going to be engaged and married. It meant that she, Bai Shuali, was going to be a mistress. Her face was pale. She wanted to leave but she couldn't move. Until Yi Mulin suddenly looked up at her. Their eyes met, and she felt indescribably embarrassed. Her eyes were hot, and her voice was hoarse. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have come. As she spoke, she turned around and ran to the other side of the hospital corridor. Yi Mulin's gaze froze for a few seconds. Then, he put down the document in his hand and quickly chased after them. Mulin. Wen Yuan's voice was very soft. Are you sure you want to chase after them? You're sick. Yi Mulin paused at the door and said in a low voice, I told you, you have to accept her, or else. He turned around with a determined expression on his face. Wen Yuan, let's forget about it. She held her breath, unable to believe that a man would give up such a good opportunity. He would rather take the risk to be with Bai Shuali. Wen Yuan bit his lips and whispered, Go. I'll think about it. Yi Mulin walked out quickly and finally caught up with Bai Shuali on the first floor of the hospital. She walked very fast, and her eyes were a little red. He stopped her. Bai Shuali, are you going to hide and cry? Chapter 35-40. Her eyes widened. Wasn't he sick? Wasn't he hospitalized because of the pain? Why had he chased after her? As though he knew what she was thinking, Yi Mulin said softly, Don't you know why I chased after you? Bai Shuali, don't you know? She looked at him and pressed her back against the wall. Yi Mulin walked towards her, step by step. Finally, he stopped in front of her and said in a much gentler voice, Come back with me. He grabbed her hand, but she screamed out reflexively, I don't want to. He stared at her eyes. Bai Shuali's face was frail. Yi Mulin, I'm begging you. I don't want to go. You can have Wen Yuan to take care of you. Why do you have to make things difficult for me? Why do you keep making things difficult for me? She shook her head as though she had gone crazy. I'm already in this state and you still want to make things difficult for me. Yi Mulin, do you have a heart? Have you ever thought about me? If she didn't love him, she wouldn't have cared about Wen Yuan. But when she still cared, she had to face Wen Yuan's existence. Actually, the person she hated the most wasn't him. It was herself. She couldn't accept that she still loved him. When she saw Wen Yuan, she knew clearly that she still cared about him. She squatted down like a little girl, covering her face and crying. She was extremely embarrassed. She felt that she was very cheap. Yi Mulin squatted down as well. Although this action made his stomach hurt, he insisted on squatting down. He stared into her eyes and said softly, Bai Shuali, why are you crying? She covered her face and didn't want to talk to him. She also knew that she was being a little stubborn. He was clearly sick, but she still wanted him to squat here to accompany her. Go. She said hoarsely, Go and find Wen Yuan. Yi Mulin sighed. My stomach hurts. Surely, are you sure you want to keep messing with me? She was still crying and ignored him. He sighed. Wen Yuan has already left. Bai Shuali, help me to the ward now. She looked up. He smiled at her. His face was as pale as a sheet, but he was still smiling. Bai Shuali was stunned and immediately helped him up. What's wrong, Yi Mulin? He looked at her and chuckled. It's nothing. It's just a little painful. I think I might need an emergency operation. He smiled, but his fingers were tightly gripping her hand. Bai Shuali cried again and said in a hoarse voice, Doctor. Doctor, come here quickly. Amidst the chaos, Yi Mulin was sent to the operating room for surgery. Bai Shuali did not leave. She stood at the door of the operating room in a daze. She had signed it because it was an emergency. Wen Yuan came over again, but he sat a little further away. Yi Xingang and Su Fu rushed over, but they didn't say anything about Bai Shuali's existence. At this time, their son's life was more important, and no one could blame him for such a private matter. The surgery did not take long. 2 hours later, the doctor came out and smiled faintly. The surgery was very successful. Because it was a minimally invasive surgery, S will be able to leave the hospital in a week. However, you can't be so tired in the future. Work is work, but you still have to eat. Because of Yi Xinggang's status, the doctor couldn't help but say a few more words. Su Fu said a few words to Wen Yuan and came over to look at Bai Shuali. He placed his hand on her shoulder. It's okay, Shuali. Don't cry. Chapter 35-41. Later on, she found out that it was because of Mommy Yi that her mother was able to get a monthly payment in the hospital. Mommy Yi had already given her a lot of love in the past. Bai Shuali bit her lip and said softly, I know, but she couldn't help it. She recalled how Yi Mulin was in pain before the operation. She felt pain just by looking at him in pain. He had clearly hurt her. His family had clearly hurt her family. Why was he still unwilling to let go? Why did he have to make her miss him so much? Bai Shuali cried out in pain towards the operating room, almost breaking down. At this moment, she couldn't lie to herself or anyone else. She didn't love him. She still loved him. Even if she had to break through the boundaries of morality, she still loved him. She loved him madly. Su Fu hugged her, feeling sad. She was a woman. How could she not feel Bai Shuali's pain and love? If she didn't love him, it wouldn't hurt so much. For a girl like her, she could have just turned around and left when she was hurt. It was Mulin who refused to let go. Mulin's love hurt her. The pain made her retaliate, making her want to hurt the person who was hurting her. Bai Shuali and Yi Mulin could no longer tell who was right and who was wrong, who had hurt who, and who should apologize. Yi Xingang looked at his wife and Bai Shuali. He said in a deep voice, Su Fu. Su Fu understood what he meant. She scoffed coldly, Yi Xingang, let's get a divorce. I really hate what you're doing. Yi Xingang was a prideful person after all. It was impossible for him to talk about a divorce with his wife in a public place like the hospital. He walked over to Wen Yuan quietly and gently hinted that she could go back and rest first. Wen Yuan was a smart person. She had long understood the situation and smiled. Uncle Yi and Auntie Yi, take care to rest too. She left gracefully. Yi Xingang looked at his wife and couldn't help but say, what's wrong with Wen Yuan? She can still tolerate Bai Shuali's existence. Su Fu glanced at him and smiled faintly. She is much stronger than me. You like the things that can't be tolerated. But does she suit Mulan? After Su Fu finished speaking, he couldn't be bothered to say more. He went to see his son and took Bai Shuali with him. Yi Mulan did not wake up. The doctor said that he would only wake up the next day. Su Fu gave the space to Bai Shuali. She went out to find a place. Yi Xinggang wanted to be close to her, but she refused. In the ward, Yi Mulan was lying quietly. Bai Shuali was sitting by the bed, watching him. She didn't even blink, fearing that he would suddenly wake up. His face was very pale. It must be very painful. She looked at him, her hand gently holding his. His palm, which was warm at first, suddenly became very cold. She looked at his pale face and whispered, "Isn't it good to be separated? Why does Yi Mulan have to hold on so tightly? Aren't you tired?" He was in a coma and could not answer her question, but his hand gently held hers. Bai Shuali looked at his pale and colorless fingers and felt his weak strength. It was just a little bit of strength, but he still wanted to hold on to her. She wanted to cry again, "Yi Mulan, I'm tired. I want to leave. But you. I don't feel at ease." She looked at him and smiled bitterly. "I feel very cheap." Chapter 35-42. They clearly shouldn't be together anymore. They clearly should let go, but she still stayed by his side and couldn't bear to leave. As Bai Shuali said this, tears streamed down her face. She held his hand tightly and said in a low voice, "What should I do? Yi Mulan, can you tell me?" He lay there quietly and did not wake up. However, the strength he used to hold her became a little stronger. If he woke up, the first thing he said to her would be, "Bai Shuali, don't leave." In the ward next door, Su Fu naturally could not sleep. She sat in the ward and quietly read a book. When Yi Xinggang came in, he saw her like this. Su Fu heard the voice and looked up at him. Under the light, the two of them looked at each other with eyes that were no longer young. Su Fu whispered, "Yi Xinggang, what are you doing here?" Yi Xinggang forced a smile, "Su Fu, let's have a good talk." "We have nothing to talk about." Su Fu put the book to the side and said indifferently. Yi Xinggang did not give up after being rejected. Instead, he looked at his wife and sat opposite her. After weighing it for a moment, he said, "Xian Ning has already been transferred away, and will not return to Bi City in the future. You know it in your heart, why aren't you going home?" Su Fu looked at him and smiled, "How can you take back the water that has been spilled out?" "Yi Xinggang, I'm not a little girl anymore, you don't have to use this on me. Xian Ning has been with you for so many years, even if he doesn't have any contributions, he has worked hard, don't worry. I won't break you guys up, transfer him back, and your life will be more convenient." Although she said it with a smile and a gentle tone, Yi Xinggang could hear the sarcasm in it. He sighed softly, "Su Fu, you're not willing to forgive me." Su Fu lowered his eyes, "Actually, there's nothing to forgive or not, we're already so old." She looked up at him again, "I just want you to be happy. If you're happy with her, why not? But I love you." Yi Xinggang growled in a hurt tone, "I've already found a way to drive her away. Why isn't she home yet?" Su Fu looked at him and suddenly asked, "Did you break up with her?" Yi Xinggang's expression froze, and then he said uncomfortably, "I won't go find her again." Su Fu smiled faintly again. "She came to find you. Can you refuse?" She paused. "You can't refuse." Yi Xinggang still wanted to say something, but Su Fu lowered his eyes and whispered, "I really don't care anymore." As she spoke, she continued to read quietly and beautifully. Yi Xinggang was reluctant to leave. He squatted down and looked at his wife. "Can I stay with you?" It had been a long time since he last saw her. When he went to her place, she always refused to see him. This time, if it wasn't for Mulan's illness, he still wouldn't be able to see her. He whispered, "Susu, I missed you very much." Sufu's body paused for a moment, because he called her Susu. When he was young, he always called her that, especially when they were alone. They were so good at that time. When did he stop calling her that? Maybe it was after he had Xia Anning, or maybe it was because he felt guilty that he stopped calling her that. At this moment, it didn't sound ironic, but it felt like a lifetime had passed. Su Fu looked at him and smiled lightly. "Find a place to rest. You still have to rush back to B City tomorrow." Chapter 35-43. As he said that, Yi Zhengang started to hug her, kiss her, press her down on the sofa, and do all sorts of things that couldn't be described. Su Fu was stunned at first, and then she became extremely angry. Firstly, this was the hospital, and secondly, her son was lying there without waking up. How could he do this and that? She was angry and wanted to push him away, but there was a huge difference in strength between a man and a woman. No matter how she struggled, it was useless. Moreover, she was worried about their identities and didn't want to make any noise. It wouldn't be good for anyone if it spread. She could only push him away and scold, "Yi Zhengang, are you crazy? Are you a beast? Why are you thinking about such things at such a time?" As she struggled, her hair became messy and fell down. Her jacket had long been taken away by him, and he pressed her down and kissed her. Actually, he was forcing himself at first, but later on, he was a little moved. He loved her very much, and he hadn't been intimate with her for a long time. It had been almost a year and a half, and he missed her so much. The woman he had slept with for almost his entire life wouldn't let him touch her now. How could he not want to hug her at this time? How could he let go? Su Fu's clothes were torn into a mess. Just as he was about to succeed, the door suddenly opened. It was Hao Yun at the door. In such a situation, Hao Yun should have left immediately to avoid arousing suspicion. However, Hao Yun stood there and didn't move. He stood there for 5 seconds, which was equivalent to giving Su Fu 5 seconds. Su Fu didn't waste these 5 seconds. She immediately pushed Yi Zhengang away and even gave him a slap. She grabbed her clothes and trembled slightly, not daring to look at Hao Yun. She was extremely embarrassed. Yi Zhenggang's expression wasn't good either. Of course, he was unhappy to be interrupted, but that person was his most trusted subordinate, so he could only touch his nose. "What's the matter?" Hao Yun said in a low voice, "There's some movement in B City." As he said that, he went over and whispered a few words. Yi Zhengang was a little hesitant. He glanced at Su Fu and thought about Yi Mulan. Hao Yun muttered a few more words. Yi Zhengang sighed softly and walked in front of Su Fu. "Don't blame me, I was too impulsive and didn't know how to control my strength. Think about what I've said. Take care of Mulan. Also, Wen Yuan is the most suitable person for him. With the Wen family, your son will be a dragon among men. Think about everything carefully. I know that you, Su Fu, are not someone who only knows how to play with flowers and plants. You know everything that you should know." After he finished speaking, he turned around and said a few words to Hao Yun. Hao Yun wanted to send him to the airport, but Yi Zhengang waved his hand and said, "There's no need. You stay here and take care of them. They're all making me worry, especially," he didn't continue, but he was referring to Su Fu. Hao Yun didn't say anything and just smiled faintly. Yi Zhengang still left. After he left, there was a dead silence in the small ward. Su Fu's body was still trembling slightly with her back to him. She whispered, "Get out." Hao Yin didn't. Instead, he walked over and hugged her from behind. He didn't do anything. He just hugged her from behind and said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, I can't protect you yet." Su Fu's body trembled even more. She lowered her eyes and said in a trembling voice, "It's none of your business." She wanted to struggle, but he hugged her tightly. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.